Hey everybody, it's a history buff. I'm back with Oversimplified's World War II Part 2. First one, really interesting. I love the way they do things. As always, please support Oversimplified. The videos that I comment on, I think it's important to give credit where credit is due 100%. I am just to address one thing. I am working on fixing the echo that has been coming across on this about halfway through. So I'm sorry about that. Let's get into this.
So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other Allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace.
Should be noted, the purge, Stalin's purge of I think it was 1937. He purged his officer corps. Was one reason for the failure to take Finland quickly. The other one was the Finnish troops were very well equipped for the snow defense, snowy weather and snow defense. And there were very few roads for an army that couldn't necessarily be supplied, and there were very easy targets going up those roads. Hit and run tactics. So kudos to the Finnish for being able to do that. I'm not taking sides. I just mean kudos for that, for what they did. That was very profound for warfare, because as things are going on in Ukraine right now, as I'm recording this, it's very similar.
Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure.
So for a lot of Americans, maybe other people around the world, but at least for Americans, they didn't quite realize the extent of France's colonies, especially in Africa and the Middle East, and that there were still troops that were there that were loyal to the French. To a certain extent, as Americans, we tend to, in general, to believe that France was completely defeated. Well, no, there were French armies intact in the field. They were just pledging their support to the new French government, which had gone through multiple governments before the military defeat that they suffered in 1940. So to French people, it was like a new government had come in, just like had in the past, except they had suffered a greater defeat. And so it was, you have to look at it that way. A lot of the colonies were very much intact, and Britain had something to say about it.
Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine. So he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly. He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe," and sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill
interesting note, this was his third term. Again, I'm noticing some people not from the States commenting. This is something that President George Washington first started. It was a precedent. And basically, for the most part, every president had been a two-term president. So that would be a total of 8 years. There were presidents that tried to run for a third term, and no, it never really materialized. But Roosevelt didn't care. Third term. And honestly, it was because of this that they ended up making a rule saying that you can't do it. It's always until somebody breaks the rules.
Asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston, but you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete, you take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room.
Okay, first of all, pykrete is a thing. It's like 80, I think it's 80 I don't know why I know these dumb things, but they're not dumb. But it's like 80% ice. Like there's like 10% sawdust and 10% something else. I forget what it is. But yeah, it would float, and they were toying with building an aircraft carrier out of it. And the bullet did ricochet off of the pykrete, and it went through. It missed Admiral King by not much. I think it like ripped his pant leg or something like that.
Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea. In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat.
Alan Turing that was something that has not been declassified until more recently. I think the 90s maybe, because the Enigma, the code breaking machine, was really the first computer. There's a movie on it that's great. Oh gosh, Cumberbatch, I think that's how you say his name, was in it. I can't remember his first name. Fabulous story about how they used the code breaker, or how they used his genius to create basically the first computer, and he was able to break the code. It needed a program, though. You had to program it correctly. It's worth a watch. It's great. It's Hollywood takes a little bit of their liberties, but you would love it. You really would if you enjoy this sort of like spy stuff and all the great things that England did. That is, we tend as Americans to overlook a lot of things that aren't American, but Britain, it's sort of like laying the groundwork for everything, and then America comes in halfway through and kind of takes the credit in a way. We kind of have had a habit of doing that in World War I and World War II. Not to put us down by any means, but the truth is the truth. So.
Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey, that was pretty easy, so they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian.
All right, Hitler had, it's kind of, maybe it's an ongoing joke, I'm not sure. Hitler's always bailing out Mussolini, bailed him out of the failed invasion of Greece. So he kind of moved down through Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, so they could get troops basically to the top of Greece. And I mean, who doesn't want more land? Or I think it's called Leben something. It means basically breathing room or living space. That's it. And it basically meant like a greater Germany, so that there was like a buffer around Germany, so they had breathing room. And that was their idea. They were sending Germans out, settlers to make settlements and to make them more German. So what actually ended up happening was they had bailed out Mussolini and Albania when they were pushed back by the Greeks. And then, of course, you'll see again in North Africa, because, and Hitler was a little frustrated with it, but honestly, he was very loyal to his friend Mussolini. And the Italian army was not a great army. Their command structure from the top was very, very old. It had to do with generals competing for favoritism and had nothing to do with their performance. It was really an archaic way of doing things. I think there was just like one general who was semi-competent. I think like in the Ariete division, if I can remember correctly, in Africa. But the rest of them, it wasn't the fault of the troops. It was really the fault of the organization, and that, if you're trying to be the favored general, you don't really, what are you going to do to be favored? It wouldn't have to do with winning on the battlefield. It would have to do with being favored by politics, and that's just the way Italy was, and they never did well. And I can't find many real occasions where they did well in World War II. They were always a helpful hand, but not the main hand by any means.
An invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt, and they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union.
By the way, that Middle East fight wasn't as easy as it's made out to seem. It was the one time where French troops fought French troops, and yes, you can definitely make the case that the French surrendered, but they surrendered to themselves.
Look out! With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and
if he had not done this, there could have been some. I don't know. I honestly think this is sort of like, as I said, in the American Civil War, Vicksburg was the turning point. Right here, Operation Barbarossa, invasion of the Soviet Union. For a number of reasons, Hitler probably thought it was a good idea. I'm not sure why. Maybe because they kept going in World War I until there was a revolution. He also just distrusted and disliked the communists. The purge of the officer corps in 1937, how long it took them to create, or how long it took them to, basically win the war against Finland with over 1 million soldiers. I'm not sure what it particularly was, but I'm sure it was all of those things combined. People joke that you never start a land war in Asia. Basically, you don't invade the Soviet Union. This basically cements the whole thing. But up until this point, the United States was really on its way into the war. Lend-Lease was in full effect. And within I think it's 4 or 6 months. About 6 months or so. Pearl Harbor gets attacked. And then on top of that, Germany declares war on the United States. People think that because of, a lot of people have this misconception in history that the United States declared war on Germany. No, that wasn't the case. Germany declared war on the United States. A lot of people also believe that it's because that they were obligated to, because of their relationship with the Japanese and the Italians and the Tripartite Pact, or the Axis powers, their agreements. But the Japanese did the attacking, so there was no reason for that. So Hitler, at this point, is already having these grandiose ideas, and I don't know. Put your comments down below, because the other thing is, Americans, always, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, forget about the Eastern Front and that the majority of the fighting was there. It's really not acknowledged. A lot more interesting things, I believe, happen on the Western Front. What England did, what happened in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, the raids in Dieppe, the Atlantic convoys, and things like that. But not as much gets talked about when it comes to the Soviet Union. We don't get taught that much unless you go beyond your normal range of learning about history. It's unfortunate, and I'm not saying anything one way or another towards a country. It's just that's what happened. And I think even Khrushchev said that they probably would not have been able to stop the Germans had it not been actually for the United States sending the support. And I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, but it's interesting.
Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand, and the Soviets didn't stand a chance.
Yeah, he
Germany
didn't
made
listen.
staggering progress with huge encircling moves.
Matter of fact, he spent like a week not talking to anybody. This is Stalin I'm talking about. He couldn't get over it. He was just almost inconsolable to a certain extent till he got his head straight.
Capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow.
I just want to mention that because Germany had taken over part of Poland with Hitler going coming from the west and the Soviets coming from the east, they did not have much of a defensive line there. In the south, they did more or less, and it was overrun. But they in 1939 is when the 1939 is when the invasion of Poland happened, and the Soviets then snuck in from the east. That's only 2 years, and you can't create much of a front, a defensive front in 2 years. You could say the Maginot Line, but that in France, it was, oh gosh, the idea of it started in like the 20s, and construction went on for a long time with it. There were some obstacles that the Soviets were able to put up, but this lightning war, this mobile warfare was really fantastic in terms of winning, and in terms of moving quickly and outmaneuvering your opponent. And it's shown here. I mean, look at all these encirclements, these pincer moves. And envelopments, double envelopments. I mean, you're talking hundreds of thousands of soldiers. That's you got to replace that.
And that's it. It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No. Keep going." "But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine. Keep going." "We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift." "Perfectly normal. Keep going." Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon.
You got to give credit where credit is due. I mean, some people say, like, the dastardly Japanese, how could they, surprise raid? There was a message coming through, and the Americans in Washington were getting parts of it as it was coming through. I think it was by the time page 4 was being sent, they couldn't respond quick enough to get Pearl Harbor ready for an attack, but they knew war was coming. The Americans knew war was coming. To say they didn't it's pretty much been debunked. Now, whether you could say that Roosevelt knew when and where, that's different story. That's up for debate. But war was coming, and it was obvious that the U.S. was going to be involved. But by the way, you don't, if you want to win a war of aggression necessarily, you don't necessarily declare war and then attack. You attack, and the Japanese attacked and declared war basically at the same time. The Germans did the same in Poland, so it's the way it is. But
In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them. For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war.
You can actually see that happening right now in the Ukraine. From what we can ascertain, what I've understood, you're talking human wave attacks. Basically, here's a gun, go. Here's a gun, go. Push forward. It's maybe not that simple, but you find a lot of that in Stalingrad. There's some great movies that explain how people they cross I think it's the Volga River, and they're given one person was given a rifle, one person was given a clip of ammo, and they went in. And you're talking horrible. Christian. It really was terrible. And this is also another point of Hitler getting involved with military planners, or meddling, I guess would be the term. Strategy was changed. The decisions were no longer being made. The major decisions were no longer really being made by they were starting to become no longer made by anyone other than Hitler. So there's that.
The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, No, you stay. The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender, with complete air superiority.
By the way, the 6th Army was one of the best, if not the best, army in the German army, in the German military. There are a lot of armies, but the 6th Army was the best, and it was it like, gosh, hundreds of thousands. I'm gonna say like 250,000, and in the end, something like 90 or 91,000 were captured. Something like 5% of those lived after the war.
The Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things
By the way, Nikita Khrushchev was one of the officers that was helping out in the defense of Stalingrad. I think it was more from a political point of view, but I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to check into that. Maybe put it in the comments.
Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans, we'll do it your way. Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory,
Even the even the mafia started liberating cities. There were a lot of there was communication between the Italian Americans and the Italians on Sicily, and promises were made, and troops were removed.
most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt.
Yeah, the Gustav line.
Let's do it our way as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive, the likes of which the world has never seen before, invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came, as Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success.
Important to note, at least I think it's important to note, that Dwight D. Eisenhower had 2 letters written. One was that there was a successful invasion in Normandy in the D-Day landings, and there was a letter written, or I guess you'd call it something basically stating that it was a failure and he accepts all responsibility. It's a very interesting trait to have. I don't think Montgomery had that kind of thing. Certainly Patton did not have that. It took a very even-handed person that was the Supreme Allied Commander. And even the British still weren't okay with Dwight Eisenhower, but he was, I think, probably the best choice for the whole thing anyway. So yeah, there was that. By the way, Rome was captured the day before by a not so great general, Mark Clark, and on June 5th, he captured Rome. June 6th was D-Day, and he was not thrilled that he didn't get the attention he thought he deserved.
Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance.
That was Operation Dragoon that was in the south. That was interesting. That was under, I think, Truscott. And Churchill wanted to witness that one, and he did. In the north, that was Operation Cobra, and that was the encirclement they were talking about, and the Germans lost a lot of their machinery, a lot of, sort of tanks, supply vehicles, things like that, things they really needed. And, they had to replace them. And that was a huge problem for months, for the Germans. It's irreplaceable stuff at this point, pretty much at this point.
On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I have just the trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying surrender or be annihilated. When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army...
That was 101st Airborne Division. And there was also a tank division, a part of a tank division there too, should be noted, and a lot of artillery. They were put there. The Bastogne was basically the crossroads of that whole battle. So if the Germans had captured it on, day 2, I think, was what the timeline was, then they could have much easily transferred supply. But instead, they had to reroute everything to the front armies to keep the push going, and Bastogne was a problem. General Anthony McCullough, I think is who it was that was in charge of the 101st Airborne. He's the one that sent the note that said nuts. And honestly, that's open for interpretation, because it's like, I still don't quite understand, like nuts, like darn, and then that's his answer, or it's just it's weird. But anyway, he resurfaces in the Korean War.
Then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch
Patton
attempt
came to the
failed,
rescue.
and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. 2 of the Axis nations had been knocked out. 1 to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland.
Oh, yeah.
The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the U.S. ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice.
By the way, that two interesting things occurred there. One is the kamikazes took out a lot. People think, the end of the war, not so bad, but kamikazes took out a lot of American shipping, killed a lot of people. The battle for Okinawa saw Benjamin Buckner Jr., General Benjamin Buckner Jr. I think it was either Major General. I think it was Major General. He was the son. First of all, he was killed, the highest ranking general to be killed. And he was the son of a Civil War general who actually lent money to U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, during before the Civil War, and had to surrender Fort Donelson to him. And then, of course, he was paroled afterwards and gets to fighting again. But this is his son. It's interesting. I think Nathan Bedford Forrest's son or grandson also fought in this war. There's Douglas MacArthur, his son. there's Arthur MacArthur, who was Civil War in the North. His son Douglas MacArthur is fighting in the South, as was mentioned. And the other one was Teddy Roosevelt's son, Teddy Roosevelt Jr. He was about to take over the 50th or 51st Division, I think, after he landed on Utah Beach, and was, by the way, helped direct a misguided landing zone, helped direct the troops to the correct landing zone, and was going to be given a promotion for that, and then he had a heart attack. His family he and his dad both had some health issues.
Either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use.
Oh my gosh, at this point, who is it? Roosevelt died, and so that makes Truman the president. He decides to drop the atomic bomb. And also, is it Clement Attlee or Adlai Stevenson? Clement Attlee, I think it's Clement Attlee. Is just double check here. No, I don't have it on. Okay, well, is Prime Minister of England. So Churchill is out. To his dismay, actually, he's surprised, but he becomes Prime Minister again in the 60s, I think.
America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki. The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war.
Yeah, well, stop it right there, because I think we can do the other one another time. But that's the Oversimplified World War II, and it's part 2. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you would like to, I'd appreciate comments down below, and if you could subscribe, that'd be great. Thumbs up. I mean, let me know what you think. Hopefully in a constructive way, but it's YouTube, so there you go. All right, guys, talk to you later. Have a great one.